Welcome to our next podcast in the continuing series for 2022, the year of clinical outcomes. If you are listening to this podcast today, there is a strong possibility that you are an HME provider of respiratory services. So how efficient is your respiratory team? Do you find that, by definition, your team is performing at their peak level of performance, that uses the least number of inputs to achieve the highest amount of output? Does that sound like your respiratory department? In today's conversation, you will hear from two of the industry's leading experts on respiratory outcomes who share their experiences in creating, sustaining an efficient respiratory team. Hello, friends. This is Coach Ty Bello, and I am grateful to be with all of you today. I'm honored to have joining our conversation Zach Gantt, Chief Executive Officer, and our newest guest, Carrie Proffitt, Vice President of Clinical Operations for Encore Healthcare. Welcome to both of you, Zach and Carrie.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks for having us on today.
Pleasure. Carrie, welcome. I'm glad you're here with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good deal. So let's jump in. So as we continue this series, 2022 Year of Clinical Outcomes, and as we laid out in the past, we all felt that today's topic is one that would resonate deeply with our listeners, the providers. So Zach, can you start us off today and help us wrap our arms, if you will, around efficiency in our respiratory team? Specifically, what is maybe the paradigm that providers face today regarding efficiency on their team?
Yeah, Ty, I think right now we've got kind of a perfect storm going on in the industry. Like we've been talking about in the previous podcast, it's the biggest opportunity that we've ever had when it comes to how do we use what we've always called value-based services. So the value-added services that we provide as part of the equipment process, to now go into this value-based care model where we do some of the things that we've done for years in providing clinical services and outcomes to be able to win more business. How do we make that kind of shift? And the challenge that we face is, even though we have this huge opportunity today to be able to go out and win more business by using clinical outcomes and by offering that value, and eventually even getting paid for some of those types of things, we also have a perfect storm of challenges. And that is that you've got staffing shortages. We have nobody in the industry has been immune to these staffing challenges that we've seen, from entry-level positions all the way up through leadership positions, but especially in the respiratory care side. And because of the COVID being a respiratory virus, respiratory therapists were in high demand, and we have gotten to a place where RTs have really been able to dictate where they go work and how much they get paid. And it's left home care in a position where we can't charge our customer more. And so therefore we're kind of stuck in what we can pay for respiratory therapists for the most part. And so we didn't have the luxury of a hospital or other people that could just pay more to get more therapists. So we've had this huge staffing challenge. The other thing that's been, I think, a challenge for the industry has been adopting remote models. This was a perfect time during a pandemic, time where staffing shortages are there, to be able to adopt remote models. And we have not done a great job of doing that. And I think that's one of the things that we have to figure out, is if we're going to win and become efficient in this new world that we live in, because post-COVID is what people call it, but we are still in some of the same crises that we had before. And so if we're going to be efficient in this new model, how do we start to adopt some of those remote models that we're going to talk about today? And then in doing that, you get caught up in the daily grind. And so you're just trying to operate the business. But at the same time, don't forget about this opportunity that I just mentioned, that now is the time to be tracking outcomes, to do clinical models, to be able to win more business. And so it would be so easy for you to get caught up in the day-to-day operations of just surviving, and you would miss the opportunity to thrive over here on the other side.
That's interesting information. We really are facing a major paradigm shift in this post-pandemic environment, as you said earlier. I find that your information that you shared, obviously about staffing, very important, but then really about the adaptation, maybe the lack thereof adaptation that we've had. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this conversation because I think you're going to paint, both of you are going to paint a very good picture for some of our providers. So great job. Thanks for that. Carrie, first, why don't you share briefly, because you're our newest member to our podcast, our Encounter podcast. Why don't you share briefly with our listeners today your role at Encore and maybe a little bit about, help us understand what some of the resources that you have seen and maybe experienced that has brought great efficiency to providers and their respiratory team?
Yeah, my role in the company is to ensure clinical excellence across all of the program services that we offer through our direct respiratory care and our software programs. And I also ensure that our customers are executing that excellence as well. And I think as far as the efficiencies that I've seen be most successful in companies that have adapted new technology. So many companies are finally using software to manage their patients, and not only their patients, but also their productivity with their respiratory therapist. We have many different remote models that are available now that, before COVID would not have even been heard of. And many companies are finally starting to see the value in those remote models. And I'll have more I can say about those remote models, depending on which level of care your patient is. You want to be able to really have the ability to give them the flexibility now. You can, instead of driving an hour and a half, you can remote in, talk to them on the video. It's a lot different world than we live in. Customers and patients are a lot more used to using videos to talk to their physicians. So why not their home care companies?
Telehealth sure has captured us, hasn't it? And maybe it's about time. Pandemic probably escalated that quite a bit. So why is this efficiency so critical? I'm going to use that word, maybe important to the provider today, and ultimately to the patient who has been really entrusted to our care as providers.
Well, if you think about it, we are operating on much higher costs than we used to as an industry, with the staffing challenges, with supply chain challenges, with recalls. All the things that have happened have created, again, kind of a perfect storm from a different angle, that it costs more to do business. And so efficiency means that you're going to drive more revenue to your business, and you're going to be able to make a better margin. But it also means that it puts you in a position to move towards this outcomes model. And I believe the rules of engagement have really changed. If you look at the rules and regulations that are out there around STAR clause and some of those things we've talked about on previous podcasts, as well as just the market in general. Used to, a hospital was a hospital, a doc was a doc. Well, now everybody is a payer. And, we see this all over the place where hospital systems are now contracting with health plans to become the payer. Physicians' offices are now becoming at-risk providers. And so if you can't manage your business efficiently on the DME side, then how do you set yourself up to be able to scale and grow and to be able to start tracking outcomes? And I say this all the time, but if you think about it, it's like when you're going to have a baby and you get married, you're going to have a baby, and people always say to you, if you wait till you're ready to have a baby, you'll never have a baby because you never feel like you're ready, right? It's the same thing about moving into these clinical models, is that if you wait until you feel like you're ready, you're going to miss the boat. And so you got to get ready now and create the efficiencies and be able to drive the day-to-day operations of the business and the clinical excellence and the clinical efficiency so that you can prepare for what's next, which is value-based care. I was at the HME Business Summit last several days. That was the topic that everybody was talking about, is how everything is changing. The model is changing so rapidly. Value-based care is the future. You've got all these new systems and payment models and ways that we're doing business. And the reason they're evolving so quickly is because they work and they're creating better better outcomes for patients, and they're creating lower costs and better margins for plans. And so this idea that we can do things the way we've always done them and be successful, that's the definition of insanity, trying to do things the same way over and over and expect different results. We're in a different world. We got to operate a different way, and technology is the way to do that. And so being able to adopt and adapt to technology is the way that you're going to be able to play in the DME space going forward.
And to your point, Zach, we've got to adapt, right? We've got to change our model. So how has the respiratory team for the HME provider really changed over the past 10 years?
Well, I think that the shift of the patient to home has really changed over the past 10 years. And so that sets a whole new precedent for what the DMEs companies have to really step up and do. The patients are going home much quicker from the hospital, and which means that they're going home a lot more acute than they used to. The service level for ventilation at home has just, tripled in numbers or more than that. So I think that, you've got, like Zach has said, you've got a lot more cost into this equipment, into these patients and these respiratory therapists' salaries, and you're still not really getting any more out of Medicare or any other payer source. And so, that has definitely been the biggest change in the past 10 years. Not only, are we taking care of more complex respiratory patients in the home, but that has also upped the level of the accreditation. I mean, accreditation expects us now to not just provide documentation that we went and saw a patient on our scheduled visits every month, but they truly want to know what the value of that visit was. They want you to document outcomes. They want you to truly be a benefit in the home, be a part of the interdisciplinary team. They want you to see where that you're actually going back to the physician and giving the physician information about the patient. So it's really that they've made the home care an extension of the hospital and the physician's office now.
Do you feel, both of you or one of you, do you feel that the respiratory provider, their team, that we're headed in the right direction, or are we on the right track so far?
I would say some are, some are not, Ty. And if you, for years, we've been talking about this is the direction that DME is going. And for a long time, I felt kind of like John the Baptist, that I was one man out there screaming in the wilderness that things are going to change and we got to do something about it. And now all of a sudden we've seen that there's more and more believers. The industry has started to understand that things are changing and that we have to get prepared. And some companies are progressive, and they're the ones that oftentimes are the regional players. Some of the big companies too, but a lot of times are the regionals or super regionals who are seeing the writing on the wall, seeing that it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look across the industry and look at what successful looks like. If you look at the most successful companies who are growing in the double-digit numbers, who are driving double-digit revenue numbers, those are the guys that have clinical outcomes, clinical programs, and something unique. You don't get that kind of growth unless you do it through acquisitions, but you don't get that kind of growth unless you have something unique that sets you apart from the competition. And so I would say that there are the early adopters. You think about the tipping point. The early adopters have been doing this for years in their own form or fashion. Some use software, some use our platform, some use other systems, but a lot of the early adopters have been doing this for a long time. And now you're starting to see the early majority, which is we're starting to get to the point where more and more people recognize that, hey, my competition is doing this. I'm going to get left behind if I don't do something different. Not only track outcomes, but also if I can't manage the efficiency of my clinical team, then I can't get to that next phase of being able to do what I need to do to grow the business. And so you see this wide variety of what's out there. You also still see this model where you've got RTs that answer to a branch manager, and they have no clinical leadership that drives the direction of the company. And so I think the other thing that we see is the most successful clinical models, the most efficient models are the ones where you have RT leadership at the top who is driving the direction of the clinical teams throughout the industry or throughout their organization. When you have RTs that answer to a branch manager or regional manager who's not clinical, that's fine. And sometimes they have lots of DME experience. The challenge is, how do you create an atmosphere and a culture and a efficiency without having clinical guidance and leadership that drives the direction of the clinical team. It's hard to create structure and standardization and get the buy-in of the team if you don't have clinical leadership. And so I think that's where we see the companies who are doing this the best are the ones that have vice presidents of clinical operations, the ones that have chief clinical officers, the ones that are really focused on, hey, I understand I got to drive the sales and the operations, but there's a third leg to that, which is the clinical side. And the clinical side is just as important. And if I don't have success in the clinical operations, then I can't have as much success in my sales operations. And so it's really this idea that changing the way we do business, again, like we always talk about, and that's where we see the successful companies. The ones that aren't as successful, a lot of companies have doubled down on the idea that they're going to make it up in volume. And obviously you get some scale when you get volume. And we've seen that with major acquisitions and some of the nationals. But if you're a regional or super regional or a local company, it's going to be really hard to make it up in volume. You got to set yourself apart, and you got to have clinical leadership, and you got to have the ability to execute on efficiencies by having a way to track it. And that's really where software comes in, is that you've got this ability now to track everything that happens from a visit perspective, a clinical perspective, accreditation perspective. All those types of things are being managed and tracked in one place so that you've got oversight in your business. Transparency creates success. If you know what's happening in your business, then you know how to solve the problems, and you know how to fix the problems, and you know what needs to be done. If you're just, operating on the way we've always done it, some spreadsheets and a bunch of people out in the field, and you don't know how many visits they're doing or how many patients are seeing or what their outcomes are, you can't change it if you don't know it. And so it's data that is data that you can use and effectively change your business with. And so you got to have a tool and the ability to be able to drive that kind of data.
Things are just changing all around us. And to your point about the innovators, the early majority, et cetera, I mean, that's a real thing that as part of the tipping point. It's also called the law of diffusion and innovation. And it really does speak to where I think we are at today with the entire adoption, if you will, of value-based care. So I think you answered this question, Zach. I really do, but there might be more you'll add if I ask the question, so I'm going to ask it anyway. What does an HME provider, Carrie or Zach, either one want to answer this? What do you think an HME provider needs to do today to actively pursue this efficiency model in their business?
Yeah, I think again, it's just about being able to see the data, like I was talking about. And so when I was doing this without software, Ty, I was on the provider side for many years, and I had to build an entire team we had data scientists, we had LPNs, we had RTs, we had CSRs, and we had this entire team that did nothing but filter through all this data and assessments and tried to build a story. And it became unmanageable that we had so many people trying to just manage the efficiency of the business that we became inefficient because of the amount of bodies that we needed. And in today's market, when you don't have the ability to go out and hire people like we used to, and you don't have the revenue to do that, trying to build a team to track efficiency is much harder than using technology. And it's really about this idea that as an industry, again, we haven't adopted technology as quickly as other industries. And so we are logistics companies. You think about DME, it's last mile delivery. It's much like FedEx or UPS, but we don't have the same technology or logistics abilities because of the fact that we're still doing things the old fashioned way. And so a lot of what we need to do is about adopting technology, and it's also figuring out how to make technologies work with each other. It's a challenge in today's market that you got 10 different softwares that touch a patient delivery process and clinical outcomes and managing your forms and all those things. So there's not a lot of integration in the marketplace, and that's a challenge for us on the software side. It's a challenge for providers. It's a challenge for everybody. And so not having a standardized integration process, but it's a challenge that we have to just work around today, that there have to be ways that we can create these efficiencies with different programs, and eventually, hopefully, they'll all talk to each other. But adopting technology and being ready for change and embracing change and technology, I think, is the most important part of how do you move into an effective clinical and efficiency style model with RTs.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I think the combination of both answers is just going to paint a very, very good picture for the provider. Hey, Carrie, maybe you can help us with, can you explain to our listeners today what we at Encore can, how we, I guess, can come alongside of them as providers in ultimately their pursuit of efficiency in their respiratory department?
Yeah, I think the first thing would be, to talk about our Nexus software. The software really helps your clinicians track in efficiency within your program. You can truly see a clear picture of where your therapists have been, what is going on with those patients that they've seen, how often they need to be going back. I told someone the other day that my true vision of a perfect company nowadays would be we see people not necessarily on a schedule, but we see them based off their need. And that would be my greatest vision for every company to be able to accommodate that. And I don't think you'll ever be able to do that if you're not able to track the symptoms of what's going on with your patients and truly able to identify the gaps in care. So with our Nexus software, you can track the efficiency in your clinical team. You can track outcomes with your patients. You can manage all of your accreditation and compliance needs. You can create a sales model to grow the business organically. We've created a family of what we call our 360 services, and this is all through our telerespiratory programs. I always say, anyone who says we've always done it that way, that's the worst thing you can say in a company, especially if you're talking about efficiency. That will kill efficiency very quickly. So when you're talking about our telerespiratory services, we've got our Oxygen 360 program, which clinically manages oxygen patients and identifies gaps in care, uncovering the need for non-invasive ventilation or vest therapy. It's really about tracking the symptoms on your oxygen patients, the ones who've been on oxygen for a year that you probably haven't seen clinically in a while. If you're, tracking their symptoms, eventually they're going to need more equipment. And it's good to get in front of those things and be productive and try to stay in front of all of the exacerbations that you can. And our next service that I want to talk about is our Vent 360. This is basically our program to help you have your therapist focus on the patients that really need to be seen. You set up the ventilator, they need to be seen in the home. Your therapist goes and does that. Then we take it from there. We help you create the outcomes. We help keep those patients compliant. And if there's any needs that arise, we will let your therapist know, and then they can go into the home. But we would do that through virtual vent checks. We would do that through respiratory visits with your customer or with your patients. It's really more of a ventilator management in a box.
That's great. That's a great explanation, great detail in your answer. I really appreciate that. And I know our listeners will really appreciate that as well. So great job. Zach, would you kind of close us out, if you will, with your greater vision for where providers need to move toward and how Encore plans on further assisting in this endeavor?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of it, Ty, but if you think about the marketplace today and the amount of acquisitions that have happened over the last couple of years, we're in a place where there's not as many companies to acquire. There's still some out there, but if you want to grow, you have to really focus on organic growth at some point. And so what we see is that if you want to be able to expand and grow what you do, again, you've got to create that niche model. And you think about the services that Carrie just went over, it's really this idea that we built these services because we were all DME providers and were successful in the DME industry and in building out clinical models that expanded the business, from a small company into national companies, or expanded our business into a very dense market like in Western PA, where our partner Dan was able to really grow his market share and then eventually help sell that business to the Allegheny Health Network. And so being able to have the successful experience in the DME side of how do you take a DME business and turn it into a clinical outcomes business has drove the models that we've created. So the software, the technology, the tele-respiratory services where we can come alongside of you and offer services to help you manage and grow your business. It's all about organic growth. Our entire focus is how do we help a DME go from where they're at today to, and a lot of times they're in a rut when they come to us, or they've grown to a point where they're pretty flat growth because attrition is outrunning the amount of new patients they're bringing on service. And so our models are all built around how do we create that efficiency? How do we create that ability? How do we create the tools that you don't have to sit in a boardroom and try to figure out how to do this yourself? But we've got the tool, the roadmap, the recipe, all the things that you need to just say, here's how you go win more business. This is how you beat the competition. This is how you get into preferred partnerships. This is how you get docs to send you 95% of their business because they trust you, they believe in you, they know you're taking care of their patients, and we can come alongside you and do that. A lot of these models that we've developed is because when we first started this, we were only talking to a select few DMEs who were the elite clinical DMEs. Now we've got a service model or the ability to position a service with any DME, wherever you're at in the respiratory process. Oxygen, you want to get into ventilation, you're doing a little bit of ventilation but want to grow it, doing a lot of ventilation and really want to grow that, or you're in the oxygen business and just want to stay in the oxygen business but want to grow the oxygen business. So what we've done here is created an engine and a platform to drive organic growth. And I think that is where efficiency comes from, is when you can start to do more remote services, more software type services. And so to drive efficiency in the business, oftentimes you have to look outside of what you're doing and say, who can help me do this? And I think that's where we can come in.
Well, that's great. And it's a kind of a really a call out, I guess, to the provider to say, we really do, you really do. Encore really has a solution for the provider that wants to move forward in this new paradigm that we seem to be facing today, and definitely in the value-based care arena as well. So thank you both very, very much. I think this has been, I probably say this after every podcast, but I think this has been one of the most informative podcasts that we've done thus far. I know I always take notes and always learn something new. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And folks, as we close out today, I want to remind you to go to the Encore Healthcare website. Contact Zach or Dan or Ray, and now Carrie, our new member of the podcast team, directly to ask any additional questions that you may have on how you might be able to move forward with more efficiency in your respiratory team and how that might take shape. The contact information is right there on the screen in front of you. We have a few more podcasts in the pipeline that I really believe will be worth listening to. I know you don't want to miss them, so stay tuned. So on behalf of Carrie, Zach, and the entire Encore team, this is Coach Ty. Thanks for making the time to be with us today. We will look forward to our next encounter.